York Times has a long-held slogan of all the news that's fit to print, but I think that astute readers over the years understand that their operational motto is all the news that's fit to distort, all the news that's fit to suppress, and all the news that's fit to ignore.
As the New York Times, long revered as the gold standard in print journalism, lost its lofty position as a result of bias.
I'm a centrist Democrat, and I have always believed that the New York Times is the paper of record. That being said, I now see that the New York Times has become a newspaper with a point of view, and that point of view is on the left.
It's the story that consults an expert, and the expert is at a left-leaning think tank. It's the story that consults an expert, and the expert is a left-leaning professor somewhere. It's those kind of things that make the news stories lean just a bit to the left.
Some say the shift can be traced back 10 years to when Hal Raines went from being the left-leaning editorial page editor to executive editor of the paper itself. Now, Raines, who admitted in his memoir to always voting as a liberal, wrote that the religious climate of the late 90s was, quote, mutating into the new redneck church militant that would, in a few months, deliver us into the land of W, where the monkey trial gives way to the monkey grin. In 2003, Raines resigned in the wake of the Jason Blair scandal just 2 years into his post as executive editor. As many remember, Jason Blair was fired from the Times for making up facts and stories.
I'm truly sorry for my actions and what they've done.
William McGowan is a columnist who first began examining journalistic bias in his book called Coloring the News. His latest book, Gray Lady Down, looks at the New York Times.
I thought it was important to look at what was going on inside America's premier news organization. And it was frightening. The blunders, the biased coverage, the gaffes are kind of chilling.
Now, there are several major news stories that illustrate the pervasive liberal bias at the New York Times. One of the most glaring examples involves the 3 Duke lacrosse players who in 2006 were falsely accused of rape by an exotic dancer. Now, the New York Times was quick to jump on the story, but not on the facts.
They smeared those players, they jumped to conclusions.
Articles and op-eds were written titled, "When Peer Pressure, Not a Conscience, is Your Guide. A Team's Troubles Shock Few at Duke, and When Boys Go Wild."
They fell into the role of assassinating the character of the Duke lacrosse students and somehow cloaking this dancer in the mantle of victimhood.
Charges were dropped against the men in April of the following year when it was revealed that the accuser had made up the entire story.
There were many points in this case where caution would have served justice better than bravado.
But their reputations were already tarnished.
It's been 395 days since this nightmare began.
These guys had their lives upended for a year or more, and there was no post-mortem where they should have tasked a couple of reporters to say, Duke rape case, how we messed up.
More recently, the Times coverage of the Tea Party protests across the country has been called into question.
They have failed to acknowledge that the Tea Party is a large, legitimate, grassroots organization. Having written a book about the Tea Party, I know that the Tea Party I wrote about is a very different Tea Party than the one the New York Times has described.
What we had was an almost coordinated effort by every single columnist on the New York Times op-ed page to take any last act of random violence or random discord and blame it on the Tea Party.
This same liberal slant was noticeable last year when Arizona passed its strict anti-illegal immigration law.
When that law passed, you really would have thought it was something akin to Hitler's Nuremberg laws.
And when Arizona Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was shot by a deranged man earlier this year, the New York Times rushed to judgment once again. Within hours of the tragic shooting, Paul Krugman wrote on his blog, quote, "We don't have proof yet that this was political, but the odds are that it was. She's been the target of violence before. Her father says that the whole Tea Party was her enemy. And yes, she was on Sarah Palin's infamous crosshairs list.
In 2007, Bill Keller, who was the editor, insisted that the paper had no political or ideological agenda, that they simply reported the facts. But that wasn't the case in the aftermath of the Tucson massacre, certainly when you had the likes of Paul Krugman, Frank Rich, every hired and paid New York Times columnist trying to link those acts of violence that were committed by a single lone deranged individual and using it to try and undermine the free speech of conservatives. Their explicit, overt agenda was to try and chill conservative thought and criminalize conservative speech.
The New York Times lost its journalistic mind. It went from being an unquestioned left-of-center newspaper to a radical left-wing newspaper. And it might as well be produced by the Obama administration.